We've all been told the same story, that Western civilization is the greatest tale in human history, a straight line from the wisdom of ancient Greece to the power of modern America. But what if that story isn't the whole truth? What if the world we live in was built not by one civilization, but by many, and the real history has been hidden in plain sight? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain and reveal what they never told you. History, they say, is written by the victors. And for centuries, the victors have told us a particular story, one of progress, enlightenment, and moral triumph. They gave it a name: Western civilization. It is a narrative that begins in sunlit plazas and marble forums, winds through soaring cathedrals and candlelit universities, and culminates in the skyscrapers of modern cities. It is presented as an unbroken chain of genius and innovation, democracy and human rights, passed like a sacred torch from one era to the next. In this telling, the first chapter opens in ancient Athens. Here, philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle debate the great questions of human existence: freedom, justice, virtue, under the bright Mediterranean sky. This was, we are told, the birthplace of democracy, where citizens had a voice in governance and ideas could flourish without the tyranny of kings. Next comes Rome, the great empire of law and engineering. The Romans, according to the story, took the ideals of Greece and gave them structure. They built aqueducts that carried clean water for miles, roads that tied continents together, and legal codes that would echo in courtrooms for centuries. This was civilization in motion, disciplined, ordered, and unstoppable. Then enters Christianity, a moral and spiritual revolution. The narrative tells of a faith that preached compassion, forgiveness, and the equal worth of every soul. Churches rose over Europe, not only as places of worship, but as centers of art, music, and learning. Monasteries preserved ancient texts, cathedrals reached heavenward, and the moral foundation of Europe was set. Centuries later, the Renaissance bursts onto the scene. It is framed as a sudden awakening after a long medieval sleep, a rediscovery of classical wisdom and artistic brilliance. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Galileo become icons of human potential, and cities like Florence and Venice are portrayed as beacons of light in an age of shadows. The Enlightenment follows, with reason elevated as the highest human virtue. Philosophers and scientists proclaim the rights of the individual, the separation of powers, and the pursuit of knowledge free from superstition. Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke, and Newton are celebrated as the architects of modern freedom and rational thought. Then comes the Industrial Revolution, the moment when invention and ambition fuse into an unstoppable force. Steam engines roar, factories hum, and the West strides confidently into a new era of prosperity. The world in this telling becomes smaller, faster, and more connected, all thanks to the ingenuity and determination of Western minds. It is a beautiful, almost cinematic arc. From the Parthenon to Parliament, from the Roman Forum to Wall Street, the West is painted as the guiding light of humanity. In this story, it is the West that invents freedom, perfects governance, champions human rights, and pushes the boundaries of knowledge. The rest of the world becomes background scenery, static, waiting to be discovered, influenced, and ultimately civilized. This narrative has been repeated for generations. It appears in history textbooks, in political speeches, in museum exhibitions, and in the way we talk about modern culture. It has shaped not only how the West sees itself, but also how much of the world understands the past. Yet for all its grandeur, this version of history is not the whole truth. In fact, it is far from it. The problem is not that these events never happened. Athens did foster debate, Rome did build aqueducts, the Renaissance did produce breathtaking art, and the Enlightenment did expand human understanding. The problem is that these stories have been polished until they gleam, simplified until they fit neatly into a single, continuous line, and stripped of the messy realities that surrounded them. Entire civilizations, rich and complex, are omitted. Voices that challenged or competed with the West's rise are silenced. Contributions from outside Europe are treated as peripheral, even when they were essential. And perhaps most importantly, the violence, exploitation, and domination that often accompanied this so-called progress are brushed aside. Behind the white marble and golden ideals were wars of conquest that reshaped continents. Behind the rhetoric of democracy were societies where only a small fraction of people had a say, while others were enslaved, disenfranchised, or treated as outsiders. Behind the talk of moral order were systems of control, religious, political, and economic, designed to maintain power in the hands of a few. And behind the technological triumphs were deep inequalities. The wealth that fueled certain innovations was often extracted from distant lands, sometimes through coercion, sometimes through outright theft. The ships that carried Western goods also carried human cargo. The factories that signaled progress often ran on the labor of the poor, the dispossessed, and the colonized. Even the idea of Western civilization itself is not as ancient as we are led to believe. The concept, as we know it, was largely constructed in the last few centuries, shaped by political needs, cultural pride, and the desire to draw a sharp line between us and them. It was used to justify expansion, colonialism, and a sense of superiority over other peoples. This is not about tearing down every achievement associated with the West. It is about seeing them clearly in their full historical context. The art of Michelangelo exists alongside the wars of the Italian city-states. The philosophy of John Locke emerges alongside the transatlantic slave trade. The industrial wealth of England grows alongside the famine in Ireland and the extraction of resources from India. To understand the truth, we have to be willing to step outside the smooth, heroic narrative and into a history that is far more complex. We must see the contradictions. How ideals of liberty could coexist with systems of oppression, how innovation could flourish even in the shadow of exploitation. And to do that, we need to go back. Back before the myths were written, before the selective memory set in, before the narrative was locked into school curricula and cultural identity. We need to look not at the story the victors told, but at the mosaic of human history in all its tangled connections. Because the West did not develop in isolation. Ideas, technologies, and institutions crossed borders long before the concept of Western civilization existed. Trade routes carried more than goods. They carried mathematics, philosophies, religions, and ways of governing. Empires rose and fell in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, influencing and interacting with Europe in ways that the traditional story conveniently overlooks. To uncover the truth, we have to be willing to ask uncomfortable questions. Who is left out of the story? What forces were at work behind the celebrated achievements? And what does it mean when we realize that the West's rise was not a solitary climb to greatness, but a process deeply entangled with the rest of the world? The narrative we have inherited may feel timeless, but in reality, it is a product of selective memory, a crafted identity. It is a story that was built to inspire pride, justify dominance, and create a sense of unity. And like all stories, it reveals as much in what it leaves out as in what it tells. The truth is more complicated, more interconnected, and often more uncomfortable. But it is also more human. It allows us to see that history is not the tale of a single civilization standing above the rest, but the story of countless peoples influencing, challenging, and shaping one another. If we can strip away the polish and look honestly at the past, we may find a richer, truer understanding of how the world came to be and how the myths we still live by were born. The truth is, what we call Western civilization is less a continuous tradition handed down like an unbroken family heirloom, and more a patchwork, stitched together from many cultures, many worlds, and many centuries of both collaboration and conflict. Its origins are not neatly confined to one region, nor do its achievements belong solely to the West. Instead, it is a vast, complex tapestry, woven from the threads of countless civilizations, often acquired through war, trade, and cultural borrowing. Consider, for example, the celebrated ancient Greek wisdom. The mathematics attributed to Pythagoras did not arise in isolation. The principles of geometry he is credited with were influenced by earlier Babylonian mathematics, a tradition that had been developing for centuries in Mesopotamia. The famed medical practices of Hippocrates likewise drew heavily from Egyptian medical knowledge, which had already cataloged diseases and surgical techniques long before the Greeks applied their refinements. Even the Greek alphabet, often regarded as a hallmark of their cultural identity, was not an original creation. It was adapted from the Phoenician script, a system of writing developed by traders and seafarers from the eastern Mediterranean, whose own culture was a crossroads between Africa and Asia. Rome, too, is remembered for its monumental achievements in law, architecture, and governance, but its greatness did not spring purely from internal genius. The empire built its power not just on engineering marvels and military discipline, but through relentless expansion. Conquest, slavery, and tribute were the lifeblood of Rome. Gold from Spain, grain from Egypt, and soldiers from the provinces flowed into the heart of the empire. The wealth that sustained its urban splendor and public works was often extracted from regions far beyond Italy, sometimes at the cost of cultural suppression and economic exploitation. When Rome fell, the story goes, Europe plunged into the so-called Dark Ages, an era depicted as stagnant and backward. But this darkness was not universal. While certain parts of Europe did struggle with political instability and loss of centralized authority, other parts of the world thrived. The Islamic world, stretching from Spain to Central Asia, experienced what historians call a golden age. Scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba preserved and translated Greek and Roman texts, developed new ideas in algebra, advanced astronomy, pioneered hospitals and medical techniques, and mapped the stars with precision. The knowledge carefully recorded and expanded in these centers of learning would later return to Europe, becoming a catalyst for its intellectual revival. The Renaissance, often portrayed as a miraculous rebirth of culture after centuries of dormancy, was in reality the product of centuries of global exchange. Silk and spices from Asia moved along vast trade networks, enriching European markets and inspiring exploration. Mathematical concepts such as the use of zero and decimal notation came from India, transmitted through Islamic scholars. Navigational. Tools like the astrolabe and the compass were perfected in the Arab world and in China, enabling European sailors to traverse oceans. Even the ink that printed the first European books had origins in the East. What we call a European Renaissance was, in truth, a moment of synthesis, Europe weaving together ideas, materials, and technologies from many corners of the globe. Then came the so-called Age of Exploration, framed in the traditional narrative as a time of bold adventure and scientific curiosity. Yet beneath the romanticized image of brave captains charting unknown seas lies another reality, an age of colonization and exploitation. The voyages of Columbus, Magellan, and others were as much about claiming land and resources as they were about discovery. Gold, silver, and precious stones were extracted from the Americas, often through systems of forced labor. Plantations producing sugar, tobacco, and later cotton relied heavily on enslaved African laborers, whose forced migration across the Atlantic became one of history's most brutal and devastating human tragedies. The economic rise of Europe during this period cannot be separated from these acts of exploitation. Colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Americas were reorganized to serve European markets. Raw materials flowed into European ports, where they fueled manufacturing and trade. Finished goods were then exported, sometimes back to the very regions from which the raw materials had been taken. This global network of production and exchange enriched the West, while deepening the dependency and subjugation of colonized regions. The Atlantic slave trade stands as one of the clearest examples of the hidden cost behind Western prosperity. Over the course of centuries, millions of Africans were captured, transported under horrific conditions, and sold into lifelong bondage. Entire societies were destabilized by this demand for human labor, and the profits generated by slavery were invested into banks, factories, and industries that powered Europe's economic growth. The wealth accumulated through such means became part of the foundation upon which the modern West was built. The industrialization that followed in the 18th and 19th centuries was likewise entangled with global exploitation. Cotton from the American South, grown and harvested by enslaved people, fed the textile mills of England. Rubber from Southeast Asia and Africa fueled the new age of machinery. Coal and steel production often relied on colonial markets and colonial labor. The narrative of self-sufficient Western progress overlooks the fact that much of the raw energy driving the Industrial Revolution was extracted from lands and peoples beyond Europe's borders. Even in the realm of science and medicine, the West's breakthroughs were not entirely isolated. Botanical knowledge from South America informed European pharmacology. Chinese and Indian medical practices influenced treatments and techniques in European hospitals. Observations gathered by explorers, missionaries, and traders in Africa and the Pacific contributed to advancements in natural history, cartography, and anthropology. The so-called Western scientific revolution was enriched, and in some cases made possible, by the knowledge and resources of non-Western societies. This is why the neat and linear narrative of Western civilization is misleading. It presents history as if the West's achievements emerged solely from its own soil, when in reality they were fertilized by a constant flow of influences from across the globe. It frames cultural exchange as a one-way street, with the West as the originator and the rest of the world as the recipient, when in fact the reverse was often true. To acknowledge this interconnected history is not to deny the West's accomplishments. The architectural beauty of Florence, the political innovations of the United States, the technological marvels of the industrial age, these are real and significant achievements. But they did not occur in isolation, and they were often accompanied by processes of conquest, appropriation, and control. Creativity and coercion coexisted. Progress and oppression were intertwined. Seeing this fuller picture changes how we understand not only the past, but also the present. The systems of trade, political dominance, and cultural influence that developed over centuries did not simply vanish with the end of formal empires. Many of the inequalities and tensions in today's world are rooted in these historical relationships. By recognizing how deeply interconnected human history truly is, we gain a clearer sense of why the global order looks the way it does, and how it might be changed. In short, Western civilization was never purely Western. It was and remains a global creation, built on exchange, yes, but also on conquest, on innovation, yes, but also on exploitation. Understanding this duality does not diminish the achievements of the past. It grounds them in reality. It allows us to appreciate the brilliance of human creativity, while remaining aware of the costs at which that brilliance was often purchased. History, when told in its entirety, is not a story of isolated greatness, but of constant interaction. The West rose not by standing apart from the rest of the world, but by engaging with it, sometimes through peaceful trade and mutual learning, and other times through war, domination, and extraction. To see only the glory is to miss half the truth. To see both the light and the shadow is to understand the whole. By confronting the myths and omissions of the traditional story, we can begin to tell a richer one. A story in which no civilization exists in isolation. A story where influence flows in many directions, where the so-called periphery shapes the center, and where humanity's shared achievements belong to us all. And in doing so, perhaps we can learn from the mistakes of the past and avoid repeating its darkest chapters.